I'm Lauren Matthews, 28, and I've always been the one people could count on even when no one was watching. I spent years caring for my grandfather, driving him to appointments, managing his bills, keeping the house running, while my brother stayed at a distance, promising he'd make it right someday. But when he stood up at Grandpa's funeral and announced he was taking the house and land for himself, without warning, without truth, I made a decision that changed everything. Have you ever been blindsided by someone you trusted, someone you supported, only to watch them rewrite the story to cut you out of it? If you have, drop your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I tell you what really happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to reclaim something that was rightfully yours, hit that like button and subscribe, because these stories matter. And what happened next might just remind you that the quiet ones often hold the most power. I grew up in a town where everybody knew everybody. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid, predictable. The kind of place where you run into your fifth grade teacher at the grocery store and still feel like you should apologize for talking during math. Our family home was about 20 minutes from my grandfather's farm. It wasn't technically a farm anymore. Just a few acres, a creaky house, and a barn that hadn't housed livestock in decades. But we always called it that. The farm. Like it meant something. And to me, it did. My parents split when I was 12. My brother, Ethan, was already halfway out the door by then. He was 17, full of attitude, and itching to get away. I remember him yelling at Mom in the driveway, saying he wasn't coming back after graduation. And he didn't. He took a job in the city, started posting photos from rooftop bars, got a dog he never trained, and only came home for holidays, if that. I stayed, not because I had to, but because it felt like someone needed to. Grandpa Joe was the steady hand through all of it. He wasn't loud or overly affectionate, but you knew where you stood with him. He didn't say much, but when he did, it stuck. After the divorce, I started spending weekends at his place. I'd help him rake leaves, organize tools, fix the gutter that always sagged after the first snow. Sometimes we didn't even talk. We'd just sit on the porch with coffee and watch the wind knock branches around. It sounds boring, I know, but it's where I felt most myself. By the time I hit college, Grandpa's knees were giving out and he was having trouble driving. So I took over his errands. I'd come home from classes on Friday afternoons and head straight to his place. We had a rhythm. Saturday mornings were groceries and prescriptions. Afternoons were spent fixing whatever had broken that week. Sundays, I cooked enough meals to freeze before heading back. I didn't see it as a burden. He never asked me to do it. I just did. Ethan would text once in a while, usually around birthdays. One year he sent Grandpa a smart thermostat for Christmas. Didn't install it, didn't call to explain how it worked, just had it shipped with a generic card. I found it still in the box 3 months later, sitting on the kitchen table under a pile of junk mail. When Grandpa's health started really declining, I moved in. I was 26. Left my apartment, downsized most of my stuff, and kept my job remote. It wasn't a dramatic decision. He needed help and I could give it. So I did. There were doctor visits, specialist referrals, early morning appointments in buildings with terrible parking. Some nights, I had to wake him up every few hours to monitor a new medication. Other nights, I'd find him in the kitchen, confused, asking why his mother hadn't called. I learned what his different silences meant. I got good at answering the same question 10 times without showing it bothered me. Money was tight, but I made it work. I used my own savings for some of his medications when the coverage got complicated. Paid a plumber out of pocket when the water heater died. Did the taxes myself after his accountant retired. I didn't keep a spreadsheet. I wasn't tracking every dollar. I just figured Ethan and I would sort it all out later. Every now and then, Ethan would check in. A text, a call. One time, he sent me a DoorDash gift card with a note that said, "Take a break sometime." It was signed with an emoji. Grandpa asked if I'd heard from him, and I always said yes, even if I hadn't. I didn't want him to feel like Ethan had disappeared. Maybe I didn't want to admit it to myself either. Still, Grandpa never badmouthed him. That wasn't his way. He asked about Ethan's job, his girlfriend, how the city was treating him. When he got mail addressed to the Matthews family, he left it on the table for me to open. He never said anything, but I knew what it meant. There was one afternoon, maybe 6 months before he passed, when we were sitting in the den going through old photo albums. He pointed at a picture of me on his lap when I was a toddler and said, "You were always right here." He tapped his chest. Then he looked at me for a long time. I thought he might say something more, but he didn't. Just closed the album and asked what we were having for dinner. Around that same time, Ethan started asking more questions. Nothing major, just little comments here and there. What kind of shape is the house in? Or, has Grandpa talked about writing things down formally? Once he brought up the idea of consolidating assets. I remember thinking it was a weird phrase to use for a family home that needed a new roof. I asked him if he wanted to come by and see Grandpa. He said he was slammed with work, but definitely soon. That was in February. Grandpa passed in August. Ethan showed up at the funeral, wearing sunglasses and hugging people he hadn't seen in years like he was at a reunion. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Everyone knew who had been there and who hadn't. In the weeks leading up to the funeral, I found paperwork Grandpa had tucked into a drawer in his room, a typed letter, notarized, a copy of the updated will. He'd named me executor and sole beneficiary. I called the lawyer to confirm it was legit. It was. I didn't tell Ethan. I didn't tell anyone. I just kept it safe. Ethan used to say he'd make it right someday, that all the weekends he missed, all the time I put in, that it would even out, that he'd figure something out when the time came. I guess he figured something out, all right, just not the way he thought, and definitely not the way he expected. Because the thing about showing up, it's not flashy, it doesn't get applause, but people remember, especially the ones who matter. About 3 years before Grandpa died, Ethan started showing up with a different kind of energy. He had always been distant, but now he was curated. His hair was sharper, his clothes more expensive, his emails clipped and professional, even when it was just me on the other end. I'd get the occasional text asking how Grandpa was doing, but more often they were vague check-ins that felt more like a formality than actual concern. He started CCing me on messages to Grandpa's lawyer and insurance agent, even though I was the one managing all of that. Once, he asked if Grandpa had considered centralizing his assets. I asked him what that meant, and he sent back a link to an article about estate planning and property leverage. It felt out of step with what was actually happening on the ground. Prescription refills, adjusting his walker, sitting in waiting rooms for appointments that sometimes ran 2 hours behind. I was living it. Ethan was floating above it all, sending strategic suggestions from his phone between meetings. The visits stopped altogether not long after that. He claimed work was too demanding, that his new position had him locked in most weekends. I didn't push, I stopped expecting anything. Grandpa didn't seem surprised either. He asked about Ethan less and less, and when he did, it was usually just, "He doing all right?" I always said yes. But Ethan still liked to talk about the property. That never changed. He called it the house when we were younger. Then it became the land. Eventually, it was just the asset. I remember the first time he used that word. I was fixing the back fence and called to ask if he still had a contact for the guy who used to do the repairs. He told me he didn't, then added, "We should probably start thinking about how to leverage that asset before it loses too much value." I didn't respond. I just stared at the phone for a second, then said I had to get back to work. Things got worse that Thanksgiving. He called ahead and said he was bringing someone. I told him it was fine. I figured it was serious if he was making the trip. Her name was Megan. She wore a silk blouse to dinner and didn't eat carbs. She also didn't speak to Grandpa once. Not hello, not thank you, not even eye contact when he tried to pour her water. I kept trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was nervous. Maybe she was shy. But then she turned to Ethan and said, "So this is the place?" Like we were standing in a Zillow listing. Ethan gave her a little tour after dinner. He pointed out the original floors, the square footage, the potential for expansion. He made a joke about modernizing the whole thing. Megan laughed. Grandpa was still in the dining room, slowly cutting through a piece of turkey, oblivious or pretending to be. I stood in the hallway and listened. At one point, Ethan said, "It won't take much to flip this, honestly." Flip. Like a project. Like Grandpa's home was a spreadsheet. Later that night, we were washing dishes, just me and Ethan, and I brought it up. I asked him if he really saw this place as something to flip. He shrugged. Said, "We need to be realistic." Then he added, "You've put in a lot of time here, I get it. But you made that choice." I asked him what he meant by that. He said, "No one asked you to. You wanted to play nurse. That's your deal." That was the first time I felt something harden in me. Not anger, not yet. Just this low-grade clarity that the version of Ethan I used to know wasn't coming back. He leaned against the counter and started drying a plate. Said, "Eventually, we'll figure it out. I'm not trying to be the bad guy here." I nodded. Said okay. But in my head, something had shifted. Over the next year, his comments got bolder. Once, when I mentioned Grandpa needed a new mattress, Ethan asked if it was really worth investing more in that place. Another time, when I emailed him an update after a small medical scare, he replied with, "Do you think we should start talking to someone about selling the property soon?" It wasn't subtle, but it was always framed like a conversation, not a decision. Like he was just opening a dialogue, even though his tone made it clear he'd already moved on to the next phase in his head. I started documenting things more. Not because I was preparing for a fight, at least that's what I told myself, but just so there wouldn't be any confusion later. I kept track of the repairs I paid for, the receipts, the hospital bills, the hours spent waiting on hold with insurance. I saved every email, every text, not obsessively, just carefully. There was one night, maybe 6 months before Grandpa died, when Ethan called out of the blue. No text first, no calendar invite, just a cold call on a Thursday night. I picked up, surprised. He said, "Hey, listen, I've been talking to someone about estate stuff, and I think we should probably set up a trust or something, just to streamline everything." I asked, "Everything?" He paused, then said, "The property, the house. You know." I didn't say anything. He continued, "Look, I'm not saying we do anything right now, just maybe make sure it's not all on paper as one lump. If something happens to him and it goes through probate, we could lose a ton." I asked if he'd talked to Grandpa about it. He said, "No, I figured you could. You're there." That's how it always was. I was there. I handled the hard parts. He floated above it all, offering advice from a distance and expecting me to carry it out. That conversation ended quickly. I told him I'd think about it. He said, "Cool, let me know." I never did. The next time we spoke was after Grandpa took a fall in the bathroom. He wasn't seriously hurt, but it rattled him. Rattled me, too. I called Ethan from the ER waiting room. He answered but didn't sound particularly concerned. Just asked, "So what's the next step?" I didn't respond right away. He said, "I mean, how long do you think he's got at home before you have to consider a facility?" I said, "He's not going to a facility." He said, "Okay, just trying to be practical." That was his favorite word. Practical. As if detachment was the same thing as logic. After that, I stopped updating him unless something changed. I wasn't angry yet, not really. But I'd stopped expecting anything different. I handled Grandpa's needs. Ethan stayed busy. And in his head, I think he believed that when the time came, we'd just sit down like business partners and divide everything evenly. He used the word ours a lot. Our place, our investment, our inheritance. I corrected him once. I said, "It's Grandpa's." He smirked. Said, "Yeah, for now." That was the moment I knew. Whatever story he was telling himself about how this would end, about what he was owed, it wasn't the same story I was living. Not even close. The funeral was held on a Sunday morning. Simple, the way Grandpa would have wanted. Closed casket, modest flowers, folding chairs set out in the community center near the park, where he used to walk every morning before his knees gave out. The pastor had known Grandpa for over 20 years and kept his words short and respectful. He talked about consistency, how Joe Matthews never missed a Sunday morning coffee or a tax deadline. People chuckled quietly. You could feel how much everyone liked him. Not in a dramatic, larger-than-life way, just that solid, dependable kind of affection people reserve for the ones who show up without needing a spotlight. I'd been at the community center since 8, helped set up the chairs, spoke to the woman at the front desk about the sound system. It didn't matter to me that I wasn't technically in charge. No one else seemed to be stepping up, so I just did it. Ethan hadn't arrived yet. The service was scheduled for 10. At 10:17, he walked in. He looked like someone who'd taken a wrong turn into the wrong event. Designer, sunglasses, navy blazer, no tie. He was on his phone until he hit the front row, then slipped it into his jacket pocket like he was making a point. Megan was with him again, this time in a cream blouse and black pants. She didn't look at anyone, just followed behind him and sat without saying a word. The pastor paused briefly when they entered, then continued. I sat 3 chairs down from Ethan. Didn't say anything. Didn't look at him. I focused on the pastor, on the stories he was telling, on the voice that stayed steady even as it touched on Grandpa's last months. There was a quiet rhythm to it, the kind that holds people together in a moment when things might otherwise break. That rhythm didn't last. We were about halfway through the eulogy when Ethan stood up, just rose from his seat like it was intermission at a play. He stepped forward and thanked the pastor, then turned to face the room. I just want to say a few words, he said, as if he'd cleared this with anyone. He had not. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The pastor stepped back. Ethan smiled. The kind of smile you use when you've already decided you're the most important person in the room. He said, for those of you who don't know, I'm Joe's grandson, his oldest grandchild. He and I were very close. I heard someone behind me whisper, wasn't she the one who lived with him? But Ethan didn't pause. He and I had a lot of conversations over the years, he continued. About life, about responsibility, about legacy. And I just want everyone to know how much this place meant to him. This house, this land, it's been in our family forever. A few people nodded. Familiar ground. Then he said it. He told me he wanted it to stay in the family, and I promised him I'd take care of it. So, starting this spring, I'll be preparing the property for sale. It's what he would have wanted. There was silence, then a few awkward claps. Not enthusiastic, just people unsure of what else to do. Megan smiled like she'd just watched him nail a TED Talk. I didn't move. My Aunt Martha turned her head and looked at me, eyes wide, like she was waiting for me to confirm or deny what had just happened. I didn't give her anything. Instead, I reached for my bag, found the envelope, let my hand rest on it. I didn't stand. I didn't speak. There was no scene. But something shifted in the room. People glanced at each other. The pastor looked uncertain. Ethan sat back down, and for the rest of the service, he didn't look at me once. Afterward, at the reception, people tried to keep things light. There was casserole, weak coffee, old friends telling the same stories they'd told at every family gathering for the last decade. I stood near the back wall and let it all happen around me. My cousin Sarah came up to me with a paper plate in one hand, asked, "Is that true about the house?" I said, "We'll see." Ethan was holding court near the door, chatting with Uncle Rob and one of Grandpa's old neighbors like nothing strange had happened. Megan stood beside him, nodding occasionally, sipping lemonade from a plastic cup. I waited until most people had trickled out before approaching the pastor. I thanked him for the service. Then I asked if he had a minute. We stepped into the small office near the side hallway, just the two of us. I handed him the envelope. He opened it carefully, read through the first page, then looked up at me. "I'll make an announcement," he said. I told him it didn't have to be dramatic, just factual. We walked back into the main room. A few people were still cleaning up. Ethan was talking to Aunt Martha now. She didn't look happy. The pastor cleared his throat. "Before we close things out," he said, "Lauren has something important to share on behalf of her grandfather." I stepped forward. My voice was steady. "Before Grandpa passed, he finalized a new will. It's been notarized and filed through his lawyer. I'll be the one managing the estate, including the property. No embellishment, no emotion, just the truth." Ethan stared at me like he didn't understand the words. Megan blinked twice. Aunt Martha nodded. Slowly, like a puzzle piece had clicked into place. I didn't wait for questions. I didn't stay for the cleanup. I just picked up my bag, thanked the pastor again, and walked out the front doors into the cold, clear air. No drama, no yelling. But the silence that followed me out was louder than anything Ethan had said all day. After the service, people hung around longer than they needed to. Some were waiting for rides, some were helping with cleanup, but most of them were just hovering, holding half-full coffee cups, whispering in corners, glancing toward the door where Ethan had disappeared not long after my announcement. No one said anything to me directly. A few offered soft condolences, quick hugs, awkward nods. But the questions were there. You could feel them. Ethan didn't make a scene, which surprised me. After I read the will, he didn't stand up or push back or ask to see the paperwork. He didn't even try to challenge it. He just looked at me, blinked like he couldn't quite compute what had just happened, then turned around and walked out. Megan followed him, tight-lipped, heels clicking down the hallway. I stayed, not because I wanted to, but because someone had to. People had brought food. Grandpa's friends from the neighborhood were there. One of them told me a story about how Grandpa once lent him a snowblower for an entire winter and refused to take it back until April. I smiled, said I remembered that winter. I didn't tell him I was the one who shoveled Grandpa's driveway that year, not the snowblower. It didn't matter. My cousin Sarah came over after a while. She sat beside me, not saying much at first. Then she leaned in, voice low. "Was Ethan lying?" I nodded. "Yes." She looked away, then back again. "You're the one taking care of everything?" "I already have been." She didn't press further, just nodded and said, "Good," like she meant it. Later, when most of the guests were gone, Aunt Martha came by with a stack of leftover containers and asked if I wanted to take any home. I said no, thanked her. She hesitated, then asked if I was okay. "I'm fine," I said. It was true, but only in the sense that I wasn't about to fall apart. That kind of fine. When I got home that night, I left my coat on, sat down at the kitchen table, and pulled out the envelope again. I unfolded the letter Grandpa had written, not a legal document, just something he'd typed up and left tucked in with the will. It started plainly. "Lauren, if you're reading this, then I guess I finally ran out of time." He'd written about the house, the land, the savings, how he wanted everything to go to me. Not because I was the favorite, not because Ethan didn't matter, but because I had shown up. He used those words exactly. You showed up. When things were hard, when it was inconvenient, you were here. He wrote about how families change, how intentions don't always match behavior, how love can exist, but responsibility is something else. There was a line near the end that stuck with me. Ethan was always good at telling people what they wanted to hear. You were better at doing what needed to be done. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. Mostly, I just felt tired. I put the letter back in the envelope, then in the folder with the rest of the estate paperwork. There were still things to sort through: bank accounts, property taxes, final medical bills, but I'd get to them in the morning. That night, I made a frozen pizza, ate 2 slices standing over the sink, and went to bed early. My phone buzzed once around midnight. A message from Ethan. It just said, "Call me?" I didn't answer. The next morning, I got up at 6 and went through Grandpa's desk. I made a list of everything that needed attention. Then I emailed his lawyer and asked for the timeline on probate. She replied within the hour, saying the documents were already in order. She told me to expect a formal reading within 2 weeks, but that everything Grandpa had done made the process straightforward. She called it clean, which I appreciated. Over the next few days, the calls and texts started to build, not just from Ethan, though his came first, but from other relatives. People who hadn't visited Grandpa in years suddenly wanted to talk. They didn't come right out and ask for anything. Not yet. But they asked questions. How was I holding up? Was I staying at the house for now? Had Grandpa made any special arrangements before he passed? They tried to sound casual, but I could hear the edge in their voices. The curiosity. The implication that maybe, somehow, this wasn't what was supposed to happen. One of Ethan's friends messaged me on Instagram. Someone I hadn't seen since high school. She said she'd heard about the funeral and hoped everything was okay. Then she said, "Ethan's been really upset. I know he really wanted to keep the house in the family." I stared at that message for a while, then deleted it. I didn't talk about what happened with anyone outside of immediate family. At work, I kept my head down, told my boss I needed a few more days to get things sorted. She understood. Said, "Take whatever time you need." I thanked her, but didn't elaborate. That week, I went back to the house and started cleaning out the closets. Grandpa's winter jackets, his tools, old receipts dating back over a decade. It was quiet work, but grounding. I donated what I could, boxed up the rest. I kept a few things: a flannel shirt he used to wear around the yard, a watch he hadn't worn in years but always kept in the top drawer of his dresser. On Thursday, Ethan showed up unannounced. He knocked once, then let himself in using the key he'd had since college. I was in the kitchen. He looked around like he expected the place to feel different. Maybe he thought I'd already changed the locks. I didn't say anything at first, just waited. He said, "I think we should talk." I didn't move. About what? He shifted his weight. About what happened at the funeral. About how you handled it. I raised an eyebrow. How I handled it? He held up his hands. "Look, I get it. You were close to him. You were around. I'm not trying to take that away from you. I didn't expect to be blindsided like that." I kept my voice even. "You made a public claim about something that wasn't yours. You weren't blindsided. You were corrected." His face tightened. "I just think maybe we should sit down and go over things. Together. Figure out what's fair." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I said, "What's fair already happened. Grandpa decided that. You don't get to rewrite it just because you don't like the outcome." He stood there for a second, then nodded like he understood, but I could tell he didn't. Before he left, he said, "This doesn't have to be ugly." I said, "Then don't make it ugly." He walked out without another word. Later that night, I told Sarah he'd stopped by. She asked if I was okay. I said I was. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shaken. Mostly, I just felt done. Done pretending Ethan was someone he wasn't. Done making room for people who only showed up when there was something to gain. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to defend my place in this family. I knew where I stood. And more importantly, I knew where Grandpa stood too. The next morning, I got up early and called the lawyer. We'd already talked through the logistics the week before, but I wanted to confirm that nothing had changed. She told me everything was ready. Witnesses had been arranged. The will was signed, notarized, and officially filed. All that remained was the reading. We scheduled it for 4 that afternoon. The timing was intentional. Late enough that anyone who needed to be there could get off work, but early enough that we wouldn't be sitting in some office under fluorescent lights after dark. I sent Ethan a short message. Just the facts. Location, time, and a sentence saying the will would be formally read aloud. No emotion, no commentary. He didn't reply. At 3:45, I arrived at the office. It was a modest building tucked between a nail salon and an old insurance agency. Nothing flashy. Just beige walls, a front desk with a chipped nameplate, and a waiting area that smelled like hand sanitizer and worn carpet. The lawyer, Nancy, greeted me with a nod. She was practical, sharp, and didn't waste time with small talk. I appreciated that about her. At 3:59, the door opened. It wasn't Ethan. It was Megan. She walked in wearing oversized sunglasses and a black blazer that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She didn't say hello, just glanced around the room, then looked at me like I was the receptionist. "I'm here for Ethan Matthews," she said, like we weren't both fully aware that I knew exactly who she was. Nancy stood up from her chair. "And you are?" "I'm Megan, Ethan's partner." Nancy didn't nod, didn't acknowledge the title. "Mr. Matthews won't be attending." Megan gave a dramatic sigh. "He's grieving. He didn't feel emotionally prepared to handle this today. He sent me in his place." I looked at her, then at Nancy. Nancy turned to me. "Lauren?" I said, "He was notified personally. If he's not here, he's not here." Megan crossed her arms. "He's requesting that we delay the reading until he's in a better emotional state." I almost smiled. The phrasing was so rehearsed, it sounded like it came from a PR team. I kept my voice neutral. "No." Megan blanked. I added, "This was scheduled. He was informed. We're not pushing it back." She didn't move for a moment. Then she stepped to the side and sat down in the corner chair like she was still expecting a negotiation. Nancy gathered the paperwork, cleared her throat, and began. The reading didn't take long. Grandpa had been direct. No legal gymnastics, no buried clauses. Just a clear, legally binding statement that I would receive all of his property, assets, and belongings. There were no mentions of shared ownership, no trusts, no split percentages. It was all mine. Megan didn't interrupt, but she shifted in her seat halfway through, crossed and uncrossed her legs, tilted her head like she was hearing something wrong. Nancy finished and looked up. "Any questions?" Megan opened her mouth, then closed it again. I looked at her. "You're free to contact an attorney if you'd like to challenge it, but it's airtight." She stared at me. I couldn't tell if she was shocked or just caught off guard that I wasn't flinching. I gave her the same look Ethan had given me at Thanksgiving when I questioned his plans to leverage the asset. The same look he gave when he thought he was in control of the situation. Cold, disengaged, done. She stood, straightened her blazer. "I'll let Ethan know." I nodded once. "Do that." She left without saying goodbye. After she was gone, Nancy exhaled. "Well," she said, "that went better than I expected." I thanked her for everything. She handed me the original signed documents, then walked me out. On the sidewalk, I paused. The air felt sharper than it had that morning. The sun had started to dip behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the pavement. I didn't feel triumphant, just clear. That night, I ordered takeout and sat on the couch without turning on the TV. I watched the clock tick from 7:00 to 7:45 before my phone lit up again. This time, Ethan's name. I didn't answer. He tried again an hour later, then again the next morning. The voicemails were short, controlled. I could hear him trying to sound calm, but there was an edge under every word. "Lauren, I think we should talk." Another. "There's been a misunderstanding. I just want to clear things up." And then, "You're really going to go through with this?" I didn't respond to any of them. By day 3, the tone had shifted. Less charm, more pressure. "I don't think you realize what you're doing. This is bigger than just you." I deleted that one without listening to the rest. Then came the emails. A few from him, one from a lawyer he had probably Googled in a panic. The subject line said, "Request for discussion regarding estate proceedings." It was formal, but flimsy. Nancy read the email and told me not to worry. She said Ethan didn't have a case. The will had been filed properly. No one had been coerced. Grandpa had made the decision of sound mind, witnessed by two parties with no personal stake. Ironclad. She said it twice. Ironclad. A week later, Ethan sent a final text. I didn't want it to go this way. I stared at it for a while, then put my phone face down on the table and went to make dinner. He didn't reach out again for a while after that. No calls, no messages. But others did. Relatives started picking sides, even the ones who hadn't seen Grandpa in years. A few cousins reached out just to say they were thinking of me. One uncle sent a long message about how families are complicated and everyone's trying their best. I didn't respond. I knew how this worked. People show up when there's something to be gained. When the dust settles, most of them go quiet again. I went back to the house that weekend, cleaned the guest room, made a spreadsheet of the remaining paperwork, called the plumber about the leak under the kitchen sink. Life didn't stop because Ethan didn't get what he thought he deserved. At some point, I realized I wasn't waiting for the next move anymore. Not from him, not from anyone. I'd made mine, and it had stuck. The calls didn't stop. Not at first. Ethan tried every angle he could think of: anger, guilt, logic. In the beginning, it was daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Voicemails with clipped tones, accusing me of making things harder than they needed to be. Messages that opened with, "I'm trying to be civil here," and ended with veiled threats about next steps and legal channels. I saved them all, didn't listen to most. Forwarded the ones that crossed a line to Nancy, who just replied with, "Still, nothing actionable. Let me know if he escalates." Then the tone changed. About 3 weeks after the reading, he sent a message that just said, "I messed up. That was it. No greeting. No explanation." I didn't answer. A few days later, another one. "This isn't what I thought would happen. Can we talk?" Then, "You win. Okay? You win." It wasn't about winning. It never had been. But I don't think he knew how to frame anything without turning it into a competition. That was the only language he spoke. Transaction, leverage, scorekeeping. By the second month, the messages got more desperate. He said he'd made financial plans based on family expectations, that he'd taken out a personal loan, had business expenses riding on a future that now didn't exist. He never said the words outright, but it became clear. He had banked on the house, banked on selling it, banked on walking away with a profit large enough to wipe his slate clean. And now there was no slate, just bills. He sold his condo by the end of February. I heard about it from Sarah, who saw the listing online. A sleek one-bedroom in a part of the city that always had waiting lists. I didn't ask what happened after that. Didn't ask where he went. All I knew was he was no longer on any lease, no longer on stable footing. Megan was gone too. That much was obvious. She'd posted a photo of herself in Miami a few weeks after the will reading, tagged a different man, and made her account private soon after. Another person who'd vanished when the money did. Aunt Martha called one afternoon to check in. She asked how the paperwork was going, how I was holding up, how the house was feeling now that it was officially mine. Then she paused. "I spoke to Ethan," she said, her voice careful. "He's not doing great." I waited. "He made mistakes," she added, "but maybe there's room to show a little grace. He's still family." I let her talk. She wasn't the first. A few others had called with similar messages. Some of them had real concern in their voices. Others sounded more interested in conflict resolution than understanding what had actually happened. "Maybe you could let him stay there for a while," one cousin had suggested, "just until he gets back on his feet." I asked if she remembered the last time Ethan had even visited Grandpa before the funeral. She didn't answer. The pressure was low-grade but persistent. No one demanded anything. Just quiet, subtle pushes to keep the peace. I didn't. Instead, I got to work. The house needed repairs. Real ones, not cosmetic upgrades. The roof had a soft spot over the guest room. The basement windows leaked when it rained. The back steps were warped and splintered. I hired a contractor, made a list, and got quotes. I didn't cut corners. I paid for it all up front. One morning, I walked down the hallway and realized I'd stopped thinking of it as Grandpa's house. It wasn't mine yet, not fully, but it was getting there. I paid off the last of his medical bills that March. Some of it was covered by the estate, but a portion had been hanging in limbo, one of those insurance loopholes that took a dozen phone calls to sort out. I covered the difference myself, quietly, no announcements. Then I set up a small scholarship fund at the local high school in Grandpa's name. Nothing flashy, just enough to help one student each year who wanted to study agriculture or woodworking. Something practical. Something he would have respected. I didn't put my name on it, just his. When I wasn't working or dealing with the estate, I restored things. Stripped and re-stained the old porch swing. Cleaned out the barn. Found a box of unopened tools from the 90s still in their original packaging. Every drawer I opened was another reminder of how much life he'd packed into small spaces. Nothing was wasted. Even now, his handwriting showed up on labels, notes, lists. In May, I replanted the garden. The same layout we'd used when I was 12. Tomatoes, squash, a few herbs by the fence. I left the patch by the porch untouched. He'd always liked to grow marigolds there. Said they kept the pests away. Ethan's silence stretched longer. I'd see his name pop up on an email chain once in a while, a remnant from some shared account or subscription Grandpa had forgotten to close. He didn't contact me directly anymore. No new voicemails, no apologies. I didn't chase him. One of the biggest lessons I'd learned through all of it was how easy it is to confuse proximity with responsibility. Ethan had always assumed that being born into the same family meant something automatic. That the titles brother, grandson, heir came with entitlements. But they don't. They're just words. What matters is what you do with them. I showed up, he didn't. That's not cruelty. That's just the record. The lawyer sent me a final packet in June. Everything closed, everything signed. There were no more loose ends. That weekend, I sat on the porch and watched the light fade over the yard. The house creaked a little behind me, settling into itself the way old houses do. I thought about Ethan, not with anger, not even with sadness, just curiosity, about how long it would take him to realize this wasn't about punishment, it was about consequence. And those aren't the same thing. It showed up in my mailbox one Thursday. No return address. Just my name, handwritten in slightly crooked letters on the front of a plain white envelope. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Ethan always wrote like he was in a hurry, even when he wasn't. I didn't open it right away. Left it on the counter while I made dinner. Ate slowly. Washed the dishes. Let the silence of the house stretch a little longer before sitting down and finally opening the envelope. It was a short letter. 1 page. No greeting, no closing. Just a few paragraphs of clipped, careful handwriting. No excuses, no explanations, just a quiet acknowledgement of what he'd done. He said he'd been angry, mostly at himself, and that he didn't know how to say it at the time. Said he understood now that he'd assumed too much, that showing up late still meant showing up. That he thought being Grandpa's son's son meant something permanent, unshakable. He admitted that for years, he believed there would be something waiting for him, no matter how far he drifted. And that when it didn't materialize, his instinct had been to blame someone else. He didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't try to reframe anything, just said he was sorry for assuming, for disappearing, for putting me in a position where I had to do everything alone and then defend it. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and put it back in the envelope. I didn't write back immediately. A month passed. I let myself sit with it, not out of pettiness, but because I needed the time. I wasn't interested in rushing towards something just because it was quieter than what came before. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and I wasn't looking to smooth anything over. But I didn't want to punish him either. When I finally did respond, I kept it brief. I told him I appreciated the letter, that I wasn't interested in pretending none of it happened, or wiping the slate clean. That I wasn't angry anymore, but I was done carrying the weight for both of us. I told him if he wanted to stay in touch, occasionally he could, but only if he could keep it honest. No performances, no attempts to fix the past, just clarity. He didn't write back after that. Not right away. But a few weeks later, he sent a photo of the dog he'd adopted. Said her name was Marnie. She was curled up on a threadbare couch, looking half asleep, one ear bent back. No caption beyond that. I responded with a thumbs up emoji. Nothing else. A month after that, he texted to say he'd gotten a part-time job at a local bookstore while he figured things out. Said it wasn't glamorous, but it felt good to be useful. I told him I was glad to hear it. We've exchanged a few updates since then. Nothing personal, no questions about the house, or Grandpa, or the will. Just fragments. A link to an article I might like. A photo of the garden I'd planted in bloom, which I'd posted on a private account he still followed. He commented with a simple, "Looks good." That's all. And for now, that's enough. I'm not looking to rebuild something that was never really whole. Ethan and I were never particularly close. Even as kids, he was the one who got bored during board games, who skipped chores, who found ways to make himself scarce when things got hard. I was the one who stayed. That dynamic didn't just start with Grandpa's decline. It had always been there, just beneath the surface. But people can change. Slowly, quietly. Sometimes not all the way, but enough. I don't expect a dramatic reconciliation. There won't be a family dinner where we hash it all out. I don't need that. What I need is space, room for truth, even if it's small, and a version of connection that doesn't come with strings or debts or the illusion of closeness built on shared blood. He hasn't pushed. That part matters most. When I was going through the last of Grandpa's paperwork, I found an old birthday card tucked into the back of a file cabinet. It was from Ethan, probably from years ago. Inside, he'd written, "Thanks for always being the steady one." I don't know if Grandpa ever read it, but he kept it. Some things don't need to be repaired completely. Some just need to stop being broken. Now every few weeks I get a message, a small one, a photo of a book spine, a recommendation, sometimes just a note that says, "Hope you're good." And that's the thing. Some relationships don't rebuild. They resettle. And when you've spent years holding your breath for the next hit, the quiet is a welcome change. It's been 2 years. The farm is still in my name, and I still live in the main house. I never had big plans for it. No grand renovations, no transformation into a bed and breakfast, or anything that would have made Grandpa roll his eyes. Just small things, slow improvements. I refinished the kitchen counters, repaired the fence out back, replaced the drafty windows in the hallway he used to complain about every winter. I rent out the old tool shed now, not for storage, but as office space for a local nonprofit that helps veterans with job placement. They asked if I had anything small, anything quiet. I offered the shed for $1 a year. They tried to pay more. I said no. Grandpa would have liked that. He always said good tools shouldn't sit idle, and people doing real work shouldn't be buried in bills. The garden's thriving. It took a while to get the soil right again. Years of neglect and shallow planting had left it dry and sluggish, but it came back. People in town stop me sometimes to ask how it's doing. There's a retired couple down the road who drop off seed packets at the mailbox now and then, just in case I want to try something new. I usually do. I don't talk about the inheritance anymore, not because I'm hiding anything, but because it's no longer the most interesting part of the story. It happened. It was messy. And now it's settled. Ethan moved out of state last spring. Got a job with a logistics firm in Ohio, I think. He sent me a message about it, brief, polite, with a line at the end that said, "Thanks again, for everything." I replied, "Hope it works out." That was the last time we exchanged words. We're not close. We never were. But we're no longer enemies. And that's a kind of progress, too. There's a simplicity to life now that I didn't know I needed. I wake up early most mornings, make coffee, sit on the porch, check the weather. Sometimes I walk the perimeter of the property just to stretch my legs before the day gets away from me. I planted new trees along the west edge last fall. Oaks, the slow-growing kind. They won't provide much shade in my lifetime, but I like knowing they're there. A few of Grandpa's friends still stop by now and then. They sit on the porch with me and talk about the old days. Some of them still call me Joey's girl, like I'm 12 years old again and tagging along behind him with a pair of gloves that don't quite fit. I don't correct them. They always ask the same thing, eventually. You still keeping up with the place? I smile, doing my best. It's not perfect. There are still repairs that need doing, expenses that show up out of nowhere. But the weight I used to carry, that constant pressure to prove I belonged here, that I'd earned it, has faded. Because I did earn it. Not with money, not with strategy, but by showing up, again and again, even when no one else did. I didn't realize how rare that was until it became the thing that mattered most. People like Ethan will always exist. People who believe in fairness as long as it benefits them, who disappear when it's inconvenient, then return with expectations. But what I've learned is that loyalty isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just keeps the fridge stocked, makes the doctor's appointments, replaces the light bulbs in the hallway without waiting for praise. It shows up. Consistently, quietly, until one day, someone looks around and realizes you are the one holding it all together. That's what Grandpa saw, not the hours logged or the money spent, just the pattern. The fact that when things were hard, I didn't walk away. Now, when I look around the house, I don't see a prize. I see a timeline. Every room has fingerprints, his, mine, the people who helped along the way. There's history here, but also forward motion. Plans that are small and slow and steady, the kind that last. The scholarship we set up in his name gave out its second award this year. A young woman named Iris is going to community college to study carpentry. Her thank you letter made me cry. Not because it was sentimental, but because it was practical. She said she wanted to build things that don't fall apart when it rains. That was it. A simple goal. But I understood it more deeply than I expected to. I keep the letter on the fridge. Sometimes I think about what it would have been like if Ethan had gotten what he expected. If the funeral had gone the way he wanted. If I hadn't spoken up. If I'd let his version of the story stand uncontested. It's not a painful thought anymore. Just a reminder of how much changes when someone decides to stop playing small. Because that's really what this was about in the end. Not revenge. Not ownership. Not even justice in the traditional sense. Just a shift. A quiet, steady refusal to shrink myself for the comfort of someone else's entitlement. There's peace in that. And it's the kind of peace that doesn't ask for approval. It just grows. Like the marigolds by the porch. Like the oaks along the fence. Like the space between what was and what comes next. Thanks for watching. Have you ever had to prove someone wrong, not with anger but with facts? Or been forced to protect something important because someone else thought they deserved it more? Let me know in the comments, what would you have done in my place? And if you believe in standing your ground, even when it's uncomfortable, hit like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. More true stories coming soon.